Federico, we're back with another episode of App Stories. We have 3 sponsors this week: Privacy, Instabug, and Swell. How are you today, Federico Vitici?
I am doing fantastic, thank you. Hi, John. Did you see my tweet? My first teaser.
What little tweet is that? Oh, the teaser tweet. Yes, the hype train has left the station, I think is what the kids say these days about that, right?
Yes, that is accurate. It feels nice to finally start teasing what we've been working on. It's just, I mean, we're going to talk about this over the next few weeks, but it's this massive project that is really, I mean, I don't want to share any more details right now, but it's really, we look at it as the next generation of Mac stories, building the future of Mac stories. And this is the first step. And it's this massive project that's been on my mind for really years, that you and I have been talking about since 2019. And then we actively started building almost a year ago in the fall 2020 after review season. And I'm excited. It's starting to feel real.
It really is starting to feel real. I mean, there are elements of what we've got in store that I even found in notes that I took and kept back in 2016. And I mean, those were days when I had only been writing with you for like 6 months. So it's been, there are elements of this that have been on your mind, I know, and mine for years, and really actively on our minds since the end of 2019. So it's exciting, and we'll be dribbling out maybe a few more teasers over the course of the next several weeks. And we'll be launching soon enough. But in the meantime, Federico and I are a little busy. Summertime's always kind of a busy season for us, even though the news is so slow, just because we're getting ready for the fall review season. But this year's a little extra something going on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, Federico, this week I thought that we would talk about something that I've been thinking about a lot, which is whether some of the changes that are happening right now to the system apps on all of Apple's platforms are enough to allow somebody to have a real robust research system made up of only Apple system apps. And so I'm talking about apps that are changing with iOS 15, iPadOS 15, Mac OS Monterey, that sort of thing. And at the center of all this, I think, are two apps that we use a lot, at least have historically used a lot, which are Safari and Notes. And it's interesting to me because I think there's kind of a 2 steps forward, 1 step back situation with Safari, at least where we stand today, where the design of that app stands on various platforms as of the recording of this. And then there's Notes and the new Quick Note feature. And we're going to talk about both of those things. But I wanted to see, I know you've been tempted to maybe move more of your research back to things like Notes. So what do you think?
I have been tempted, and I'm still not sure. There's also the Variable, which is this new iPad mini, supposedly coming at some point later this year with an iPad Pro style design without a physical home button and with a bigger display with a USB-C port. And I feel like that device could potentially be my perfect reading device. There's also like a rumor that's saying it's going to have a mini LED display, which I struggle to believe. But
I find that very hard to believe. Given where things are with like the Mac Pro, I find that rumor very hard to believe. But I mean, I'd love it to be the case.
Exactly. But if true, like that device will be incredible. So I'm keeping that in my mind as a potential change in the future.
This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Privacy.com. During the pandemic, I spent a lot of time shopping online, as a whole bunch of people did, and I would come across sites that I hadn't bought from before, and it made me hesitate because I wasn't sure if it was the kind of site I wanted to give my credit card information to. And that's where Privacy comes in. Privacy is a tool that makes it easy to manage your financial lives online while keeping your most important information secure. By generating virtual numbers, Privacy masks your bank information so you never have to worry about giving it out to people you don't know online. I've used this a bunch of times, not just during the midst of the pandemic, but ever since, because every now and then, you buy something, maybe you're comfortable giving your credit card information to a big website that you've bought from before, but I really do purchase things from a wide variety of companies, not all of which I'm necessarily as comfortable with. And the nice thing about privacy is that not only does it mask your banking details, but you can do things like set limits on how much can be spent with that number. So you know that there's no way for them to overcharge you. It's a really great way to handle it. And that's important because first of all, you don't want to get overcharged, but you also want to know that your information isn't leaking out to places you don't want to, where someone else might use it. Take back control of your payments. Decide who can charge your card, how much, and how often, and you can close your card at any time. Plus, you can make sure that you are never accidentally billed twice or upgraded to other services without your consent. And Privacy has even partnered with our friends at 1Password to create, use, and save privacy cards directly within your 1Password dashboard. All virtual cards that are created with 1Password will have the same security benefits as your other privacy cards, and you can set spend limits, create single-use or merchant-locked cards whenever you want. Head on over to privacy.com/appstories and sign in for an account. New customers will automatically get $5 to spend on your first purchase. Again, that URL is privacy.com/appstories to sign up now. Our thanks to Privacy for their support of the show.
I'm tempted by the changes that we're seeing in iPadOS 15 and especially with QuickNote. So for those not aware, QuickNote is this new system-wide feature in iPadOS 15 that lets you capture anything in Apple Notes at any point, anywhere on your device via different activation methods as a floating QuickNote panel. It really feels like picture-in-picture, but for Apple Notes. So whether you invoke it with a swipe from the bottom right corner of the display or via a system-wide keyboard shortcut, which would be Globe Q, or from Control Center or from Safari, you can capture anything. You can capture links, text, images, whatever, in a floating QuickNote panel and then dismiss it, and it gets saved in the background automatically into your Apple Notes database, and it gets synced with iCloud across devices in the background. And for research specifically, what makes this interesting is the integration with Safari. So in Safari, in iPadOS 15, you can highlight anything on a web page. And when you do, in the copy and paste menu, you get this new button next to select all and copy, which is add to QuickNote. Or maybe, no, first it's called new QuickNote. And when you save a selection, it creates a new note for you. And it saves your selection as this special rich link, which is a rich link, but also shows you a preview of the little snippet of text that you have highlighted in Safari. And then once you've created the QuickNote for this, you can add more highlights. So you can keep highlighting passages of text on a web page. And the button says add to QuickNote. And at that point, you are appending these new highlights to the bottom of the same note. Now, what makes this special is a couple of things. First, you can see your highlights on the page. So it's effectively a native highlighting feature for Safari. You see these yellow highlights as you're scrolling the page without having to use an extension, without having to use a shortcut. But also later, if you reopen a note, if you reopen a web page that has one of those special QuickNote rich links saved somewhere in Apple Notes, you will see a little thumbnail pop up from the bottom of the screen that basically tells you, hey, there's a QuickNote for this. And if you tap that, the same QuickNote comes up again, and you see all of your highlights again on the web page. And in Apple Notes, finally, you can search for the text of those highlights. There's a bug right now in iPadOS 15 Beta 3. Maybe it'll get fixed. I know that I filed feedback for this. So I've been a good boy filing feedback.
Good for you.
Directly to Apple. Thank you. But the text of those highlights can be searched in Apple Notes. And so if you consider this, sort of this integrated workflow between Notes, iPad with a keyboard or, using touch controls, and Safari, and therefore Reading List, because Reading List, if you're saving articles for later, is part of Safari, you can see how it becomes a very compelling, sort of consistent and integrated workflow for saving research material directly from Safari natively into Apple Notes without having to rely on a shortcut or a third-party plugin or, a proprietary app. And I think that makes it really fascinating.
It's interesting to me. I've been playing with this a bit on the Mac where you can do it as well. And there are already a lot of apps even beyond Safari and Notes that support QuickNote because it's based on an existing API and it comes for free, so to speak, with certain apps. And I've seen apps like Craft, for instance, actually support this, I believe. And I think we'll see a lot of uptake with third-party developers as a result of that because either they've already got it baked into their apps or it shouldn't take too much trouble to get those APIs implemented since they've been around for several years. So that's really nice. And just going back to the iPad for a second, I'm really intrigued by that Mini. I gave up my Mini to Jennifer because she broke hers, and I've really missed it ever since. And I got an iPad Air as kind of a stopgap because I didn't want to wait all the way until the Mini was revised. And now I'm not sure what I'm going to do with the Air because the Air really feels like more of an in-between device in the sense that when you attach a Magic Keyboard to it, it's really hard to type on. It's not a full-size keyboard. It's a little bit difficult to type on, and it's a little bit too big for reading in bed and that kind of thing. So I really want to go back to the Mini. I just don't know what I'll do with my Air at the time. Maybe I'll find a family member to give the Air to, maybe. This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Instabug. Building mobile apps presents some challenges. Bugs, crashes, and performance issues can be a nightmare for developers. But what if you could not only detect all of those issues, but also understand the quality of your app from your user's point of view? Instabug's lightweight SDK grabs all of the insights you need to build quality apps through comprehensive bug and crash reports, performance monitoring, and real-time user feedback, all in one SDK. With Instabug, you can continuously monitor and measure the performance of your app as perceived by your users. Engage with those users by letting them report issues and questions right from inside your app. Get all of the information you need about bugs, crashes, and other issues, and fix those issues in record time, all with a focus on privacy and security. And you don't have to worry about the hassles of switching to a new tool. It only takes a minute to integrate Instabug into your app, and it fits right in with your current workflow with support for things like Jira, Slack, Trello, GitHub, and Zendesk, or whatever else you use to handle issues. Join over 25,000 top mobile developers around the world who use Instabug to ship high-quality apps. Go to try.instabug.com/appstories. Again, that URL is try.instabug.com/appstories. Our thanks to Instabug for their support of the show.
In imagining this sort of Safari and Notes research workflow, if you were to build an Apple-only research system, consider QuickNote in iPadOS 15, consider Apple Notes and how you can search those highlights, and also features of Safari, like I mentioned reading list, there's tab groups coming in iOS and iPadOS 15. Like that feels to me like an ideal research-related functionality because, for example, I was researching some new headphones that I want to buy eventually, and I opened a bunch of tabs, right? I opened a bunch of reviews and product pages in Safari. And then when I realized, I'm not done researching this product that I want to buy, but I don't want to create bookmarks for these tabs. Once I'm done reading and taking notes, I'm not going to permanently store them in Safari.
No.
So I just created a tab group and I saved them there. And they've been sitting there for a while. But as I progressively read those reviews and those product pages, I just removed the tabs because that information is now stored elsewhere and I don't need to see it in Safari anymore. So tab groups as a research feature for just temporarily storing those tabs in an organized workspace, I think it makes a lot of sense for a lot of people.
I think it really does, and I've been using it in a similar way. I kind of view it as the feature you use when you start going down an internet rabbit hole, and you realize if I keep going down this rabbit hole, I'm going to be here for 2 or 3 hours reading the reviews, like you said, and looking at product pages, and I don't really have time to do that right now. So I'm going to take all these open tabs, I'm going to park them in a tab group, and I can go back to it when I have time. So That's one way I've been using it, and I've been doing that quite a bit. But I also feel like it's good for longer term projects where you might be researching a particular topic and you just can't finish in a sitting. And I used to then leave those tabs open in Safari, but then maybe in the interim I'm working on something else and I have some new tabs that get opened, and then they just kind of get lost in the shuffle, and it's very hard to go back and find them. But creating a tab group with them is a really nice way to not only kind of clean up your tab bar, but make it simpler and easier to find what you researched initially. So I've been using them that way. And I think just the fact that there's this sidebar now makes a really big difference, because I've never been a big bookmark person except for the favorites bar. I'll have, I have
same.
Right. I have certain favorites bar things like, the Mac Stories WordPress backend and things like that I use all the time throughout the day. But I don't use bookmarks a lot. But I've been trying to change that and experiment with having categories of bookmarks, since they're right there in the sidebar, not far from the tab groups. I've set up, one for podcasting and one for Club Mac Stories. And so that way I can switch that view in the sidebar from the tab groups to my bookmarks and very quickly open up MailChimp when I'm doing a newsletter, and then maybe the Images app that we use for uploading images to our CDN, that sort of thing, and seeing if that really sticks, and having, I guess, task-oriented websites all in one place in that sidebar, which has worked pretty well for me so far. What I haven't gone back to yet in any depth is Reading List, because Reading List, I like Reading List, but I haven't decided whether I'm going to try that out or stick with Reader's Read Later service. What I like about Reading List is something I know that you've been experimenting with, which is the fact that you can use this highlighting and either park things in Quick Notes or use a shortcut or something to send it to an app like Obsidian. Quick Note is, since we're talking about an Apple only workflow, that's a good way to use Quick Note, I think. But I think I'm probably more likely to pair it with another app and do it that way.
Yeah. Before I say a couple of things about Notes, I wanna say something about Safari. One last thing. I think it's gonna be interesting to see what extensions will make possible starting in iOS and iPadOS 15.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Extensions for research, I think, are going to be one of the popular categories. We put together just a proof of concept at Mac Stories where you can save highlights via a native Safari extension as markdown text in a companion app. And I can imagine how developers of note-taking apps, stuff like Keepit or Devonthink or Obsidian even, they could create companion extensions, native extensions for Safari to sort of aid in that kind of research workflow. So that's going to be interesting, I think, and we'll keep an eye on that for sure. It's going to have its own category on the App Store, so that will be one of the places later this year where we're going to spend a bunch of time just digging through and trying a bunch of extensions, I'm sure.
Right. This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Swell. Swell is a home for your voice when you're not on stage, when you're not performing live, running a room, or recording a podcast. Think of Swell like a personal audio portfolio, a quick way for people to explore your voice and ideas. With Swell, you can capture your life in audio, post your thoughts, moments, photos, feelings, opinions, and experiences using your own voice. It's like having a personal audio diary that you can post to at any time. Then share your Swellcast link with your followers to keep them updated. You can even embed your Swellcast in your own website using Swellcast's widget. Swell is a social network of users who love audio in all forms. Podcasters can find new listeners as well as new guests for their podcasts. And Swell can be both public and private. If you want to take the private route, create an invitation-only private group for your friends and followers. All conversations in groups are only visible and audible to the guests you invite. I love creating audio. I do it every single week. What's cool about Swell is that it takes away the hard part of recording and producing audio. That makes it a great option for anyone who wants to share their thoughts and ideas with the world. Swell's totally free and there are no ads. And they're planning on introducing a subscription and marketplace model so creators can generate their own revenue. To learn more, go to swellcast.com. Again, that URL is swellcast.com to learn more. Our thanks to Swell for their support of the show.
In Notes. So I just wanted to say how if I were to use Apple Notes as my research app, there's one feature that is really slowing me down at this point, which is the lack of a quick switcher for Notes. So this has become a popular feature in a bunch of apps, even really diverse apps even. I believe Acorn, for example, which is a graphics editor on the Mac, now has a quick switcher in its latest version. And the idea is a quick switcher, which we've seen in note-taking apps like Craft, Agenda, Obsidian, is the idea that you can hit a keyboard shortcut, usually Command O or something like that, and quickly navigate with the keyboard to any other area or document in the app. So in Obsidian, you can hit Command O and you can start typing to switch notes. You can do the same in Craft. You can do the same in Agenda. And it really speeds up navigation, especially on a device with an attached hardware keyboard, because you don't have to navigate the folder and file structure of the app in a sidebar using touch or the arrow keys in your keyboard. You're just typing the file name and you can go there. Now, Apple Notes doesn't have this kind of feature. And the more notes I create, like I said, I've been testing this quick note approach with Safari. But now the problem is switching between those notes, especially because coming from Craft, which we use for its collaboration features, and Obsidian, which I personally use as my text editor and note-taking app, now I'm really slow in Apple Notes because
right.
To switch between notes, I need to manually open them every single time.
A lot of navigation and opening, yeah.
Yeah. A lot of back and forth.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
And that, I mean, you've kind of touched on something about Notes that I think Notes feels like it's on the cusp of being really great for research because things like tagging now are possible and @mentions are possible. So @mentions is something that, you and I for a while used Notes to the sharing feature to collaborate on various projects. And the thing that was probably the biggest hassle is you could turn on a notification to know when someone made a change, but if you didn't have that on, you ended up having to text the other person and say, "Hey, I made a change to this thing. You should check it out." And that's a little bit cumbersome. The @mentions, I think, are a great feature that'll make that a lot easier. And tagging's nice too, just from an organizational standpoint, because it allows you to filter things in all new ways, which I always found a little bit difficult with, with folders. You couldn't really do that sort of thing. So I like tagging too, but you're right. There is an awful lot of back and forth and opening things up.
Yeah. And lastly, for research, so we talked about Safari, Notes, and the integration between them. I feel like there's another component to this, like you're not necessarily doing research in a web browser. You may be using a book or you may be using a PDF. And in that case, we need to mention the Books app for iOS and iPadOS. It's a pretty good app, and I think it's better on those platforms than it is on the Mac.
Oh, you're wrong, though. They fixed it for Monterey. It's getting a big update. So, yeah, I haven't talked about this a lot yet because I complained about this now for like 2 years, is that the Books app was much neglected on Monterey, but it's finally coming in line with iOS.
Okay, so that's good. But so far, when you're using Books and you're reading a book or you have a PDF that you're storing in your library and you highlight something, there really isn't a great way to export all of those highlights all at once. There is no support for exporting to formats like Markdown or PDF or just any kind of batch export feature, which you may have seen in other PDF apps like Highlights, for example, which is an excellent third-party option for that, but also Liquid Text, for example. If you're storing PDFs in Liquid Text, you can export all of your highlights from, all at once. Margin Note is another excellent third-party option for this. But in Books, there's no batch export feature. There's no format option. And if you decide to, I'm just going to export one highlight at a time, that's tedious, but okay, you can do it. But when you do, you get that marketing text at the bottom of every single highlight.
Yeah, the long copyright notice.
The copyright notice at the bottom of a highlight that years ago when I was trying to do this and be like, okay, I'm going to store all of my research PDFs in books. I was so annoyed by that copyright notice. I created a shortcut that processed the text to remove that copyright notice.
Yeah, it's too bad that that's there. I mean, I understand why it's there. On the other hand, it especially since you have to do it one highlight at a time, if you do that, you're going to end up with that copyright notice and marketing thing over and over and over again, which is just no good for what you're doing, especially if you're just copying a sentence or something. It's not like you're stealing a sentence from the book. I mean, it's for your personal use, right? So I wish that was gone. I also wish that QuickNote worked with books. It does not right now. It seems like the ideal feature for that sort of thing, but it's not there yet. So I don't know. I mean, maybe we'll get there, but this feels like a feature that QuickNote, the Notes team and the Safari team worked very closely on for Safari. And maybe now that that's out there, we'll see it spread to other Apple apps. And I really hope it does, because I think, there's some apps where you don't need deep integration with QuickNote, but something where you're actually have text and you're highlighting it totally makes sense. So I hope we see that come to books.
Yeah, that would be super nice. And you could save a highlight and a deep link that takes you back to that highlight. That could actually be very nice.
And preview on the Mac, there's a bunch of apps where it would make sense, but Books is the one that's across all the platforms where it makes sense to start first, I think.
Yeah. So short term, I don't think Apple Notes is gaining a quick switcher anytime soon. But what I hope to see in the iPadOS 15 cycle is, like you mentioned, QuickNote integration in Books. That would be nice. And in Notes, I want to I just would like to make sure that search works for those highlights that you're saving from Safari. And also, I would like to see more options for smart folders in Notes. So it's kind of weird because Reminders has an excellent smart list feature now in iOS and iPadOS 15, where you can create these smart lists based on a bunch of different criteria. And there's a lot that you can filter on. You can filter by tag, by list, by date, by priority. There's a lot of different filters that you can use when you're putting together a smart list in Reminders. But in Notes, you can just filter by tag and nothing else. Like, the only option that you have is create a smart list that shows you notes that have been tagged with a specific tag. And I would like it to be a little more power usery than that. Like, let me use, text found in the note title as an option. Let me filter based on the contents of a note. Let me filter based on the date modified of a note. All of those criteria that you get in Reminders, I think they would also make sense for Notes. So hopefully that feels like something that could happen in the iPadOS 15 cycle. So that could actually be nice. We should also, as sort of one more thing, touch upon the idea of, we mentioned research, highlighting, collecting links, highlights from web pages, the potential of using Books alongside QuickNote in the future. But when it comes to writing, Apple doesn't really have a good option here. They have Notes. They have Notes, which could be used as a note-taking app for research-intensive tasks. But for actually writing an essay or, a blog post or a long-form story in Notes, that starts being a little problematic because
definitely
you have limited rich text, you have no support for Markdown, and you really don't have a solid workflow for dealing with subsections or compiling and exporting a draft or storing attachments, right? And so I would like to see eventually Apple do a little more in this space. I know that they have Pages, and a lot of people write their essays, and especially like school papers, for example, in Pages.
Mm-hmm.
But for any kind of, internet-based publication or, academic usage, I really don't think that either Notes nor Pages can scale to that kind of task right now.
No, I think you're right about that. And I think the limitations on the ways you can get information out of Notes is a problem for it as a note-taking app too, just because, I want the flexibility, and I always want this in all of my apps, not only to get things into them easily, but to get things out, because notes may just be one component of a larger workflow. And right now with the rich text, there's not a great way to get that stuff out. I want to be able to get a note out in Markdown, for instance. And even broader, I guess talking about limitations a little more and going back a little bit to Safari is that, we've seen Safari take a turn where we're not at the fall yet, and I think things are going to continue to change. But I think Safari has moved away with these design changes from supporting power users and people who use it for things like research. And I kind of get that on an iPhone where your browsing is probably a little more casual day to day, at least it is for me. But on the iPad and the Mac, that's a real problem. And if Apple decides that that's the direction that they want to go, I think that they really need to open up browser support more deeply to third parties who can then fill that gap and provide those power user features. Because, for instance, I think that those toolbars that have disappeared are something that people rely on a lot if they're doing research and writing. So if those don't come back in some form as supported by Apple, I really hope that they open things up and make it a little easier for third parties to be more deeply integrated with the system, because that's one of the reasons we use Safari, is because it works so well with things like shortcuts. And that's other third-party browsers just can't match that at this point, which is too bad, but it's kind of where we stand. But I agree with you too on the writing. It would be nice to see Apple do something more like a formal text editor. I have a hard time seeing it, frankly. That Pages even doesn't seem. I mean, Pages gets periodic attention, and it's a good app. I use it for certain things once in a while, but it's not something that I would write in day to day. All right, Federico. Well, it sounds like from listening to the two of us that Apple's getting closer, but they aren't quite there. And maybe they'll never get there for two people like us who do this for a living, and this is our profession, and writing and researching. But I do think that there's more that can be done, and that would benefit people who aren't writers by trade too. So I hope we see some of these changes coming down the pike. I want to thank our three sponsors again for this episode. That's Privacy, Instabug, and Swell. Of course, you can find me and Federico over at macstories.net. Federico is on Twitter and Instagram, where he is at Viticci. That's VITICCI. And I'm at John Voorhees. JOHN VOORHWS. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.